And I think the same as that theory is the starting place for empirical research. That's why we need theory. That gives you the impetus for your research, and theory is also the place to teach students some critical thinking. I think in the humanities that's the main thing that I would like students to acquire is a critical mind. And translation theory is an excellent starting place for that. Okay, many of my students, or students in the translation fields in South Africa, end up in publishing houses where they deal with literary translation projects. Strangely enough, literary translation isn't taught as much, but many students end up dealing with literary translation. And no translation leaves a reputable publishing house without some form of revision performed. Now, the role of translation in book production is quite imminent in South Africa, since, as you can see here, we have a complex multilingual ecology of complex multilingual ecology of South Africa leads to considerable translational exchange between the 11 languages in both trade and educational publishing. Okay, so there's a vast field for students to work as translators. But no translation leaves a reputable publishing house without some form of revision performed. So we need to teach revision as well, and it's not done as often as it needs be. So revision as a process is an integral part of professional translation projects. It is defined, the revision parameters and principles are described comprehensively in the literature. So people say we don't need to teach it, students can learn themselves, they can read it. It is comprehensively described, defined in the literature. But the question remains, do the descriptions give us a true picture of what's happening in practice? Is it enough to tell students go and read the literature on revision? Or do we need to show them what's going on? Right, so can the literature alone prepare our students for the job market? Now, since revision, like translation, are mainly human activities, as Boeselen puts it, should the revision process not best be investigated by eliciting data directly from its agents and real-life contexts? And should our teaching not also be based on real-life contexts? According to Monday in 2012, and I think all of you know Monday, archival documents have been underutilized in translation studies, even though they hold the possibility of providing detailed retrospective insight into the decision-making process involved in translation and revision. Now, I've already told you that revision is described in a quite encompassing way in theory, and the person who did the most on revision theory is Mossop. In his 3 works on revising and editing for translators, the first one 2007, second one 2010, the third one 2014, he had very detailed descriptions of revision. By the way, these 3 books, mainly their main difference is between the 3 editions is the publisher. The first 2 at St. Jerome and the last one at Routledge that took over St. Jerome. Now, what I'm going to do today is to show you what theory teaches, or what Mossop has written and other scholars on revision. And then I'm going to give you the practice. I'm going to discuss case study in South Africa to show you whether the theory and practice do meet. Or is there a difference? Is it enough just to teach students the theory? Right, revision is defined by various scholars, and I'm going to give you all the definitions. First of all, revision, the reading of a draft translation by a person other than the translator to detect features of the draft translation that fall short of what is acceptable and to make appropriate corrections and improvements before the translation is delivered to the client. That's our first definition. Then it was not only Mossop who defined revision, but the other definitions lean heavily onto his original work. Revision is a detailed comparative examination of the translated text with the respective source text in order to verify that the sense is the same in both texts and to improve the quality of the target text. That was Delisle, Lianke, and Cornier. Colombo wrote, the term revision refers to a comparative check carried out on the target text and its respective source text in order to identify problems and errors and introduce the necessary corrections and amendments. In the context of professional translation, revision indicates one particular stage in the chain of production of translated documents and can be defined as the process aimed at identifying features of a draft translation that falls short of the required quality standards and at introducing the necessary amendments and corrections. Now, Skokera, and by the way, I've taken these two definitions from Skokera 2013, Skokera points out that revision seems to be identified by the comparative aspect, as can be seen in the following definitions. Skokera wrote, a comparative examination is a typical and critical trait of revision. Revision only takes place when a cross-check between the source text and target text is performed, but the extent of the cross-check will vary in different situations. When a self-revision is performed, the cross-check might be omitted, presuming that the translator has already performed this action while drafting the translation. And she says there's a continuum of possibilities for different instances of other revision, regarding from a full reading of both the source text and the target text to a revision based on a target text reading only. Now, this latter type of revision, the one with the target text only, here she undermines her own premise that a revision relies on a comparative reading. So now the question comes, what then is the difference between editing and revision? If revision should be a comparative reading, Skokera says comparative reading can be omitted. So what then is the difference? Do we need the different terms revision and editing? That is a lecture or a talk for another night, but think about it. What I do like about Skokera's definitions is her etymological perspective on revision. She tells us where the term comes from revisere, to look again. In other words, an additional examination of the text. A fresh approach, the translator sees anew, not only the translator or another person taking a new look or with new eyes, as if seeing the text for the first time. So, according to Skokera, this etymological definition does not tell us much of the actual nature and scope of the actions performed by a reviser. She's quite correct about that, but it does give us a very good perspective. And I find this etymological definition of hers extremely useful. Now, the rest of tonight, I'm going to work with two assertions or statements by Mossop. I don't want to call them assumptions. Right, the first one is that Mossop states that revision is not only performed by a person other than the translator, but also by the translator him or herself. And he makes a clear distinction between two main types of revision according to the agent performing the task, namely self-revision, translator checks his or her own revision, translation, and other revision where another agent, could be another translator, but another person checks the translation by a first translator. A clear distinction, and I don't like this clear distinctive stuff in translation studies. We'll get back to this binary assumptions later. So that's our first assertion. The second one is that revision relies on two functions, a gatekeeping function and a language therapy function. Gatekeeping refers to accuracy regarding the source text and the language used, the target language used, whereas language therapy refers to customization of the target language for the target readers. So once again, a distinction in the revising functions. And what's even worse is that Mossop assigns these two functions to specific agents. He says the following: the conflicting interests in revision can be solved by the conflicting interests in the process of translation, can be solved by the translator and reviser taking different stances. It then goes on to say that the translator is the person doing the gatekeeping function. The translator is the person who tries to find the balance between the author and the reader. In other words, the retrospective and the prospective function, orientation. Whereas the reviser shifts to another function in the social network that is being constructed. Now, by the way, the term social network and actor and agent, they are not Mossop's terms. They are terms that I apply. Okay? So, the reviser, according to Mossop, leans towards the needs of the readers. And they try to see the text from the reader's point of view. So the reviser takes on the language therapist function. Once again, you have the divide, not now only between the two functions, but you also have the divide between the two types of agents. Okay? So that's the second assertion of Mossop that I would like to discuss if we have the time. Let's just go through what specifically is meant by language therapy and by language or by gatekeeping. Let me find a shortened version of what I have written here for you. Yes, the language therapy is the reviser tries to meet the needs of readers always. And that is now the other reviser. Tries to meet the needs of readers always and the needs of others if possible. The gatekeeper looks at accuracy, at grammar, at idiomaticity, etc., etc. So it's very strange to assign these two different functions to specific. The translator is the gatekeeper, the reviser, the language therapist. So the self-reviser is the gatekeeper, and the other reviser is the language therapist. Now, it's also not clear when is this gatekeeping task of the translator, does this now happen during the translation or during the self-revision? So that isn't clear either. When happens what? Now, these two assertions of Mossop cannot be taken on face value. And I've decided to verify what he has said by taking or by investigating what is happening in real production processes. So now we're going to the real life. And the case study that I've done is I've used professional revisions performed on 3 works of fiction translated in a larger book production company in South Africa. And all the translations were from Afrikaans into English. These book production companies, they have in-house project managers, obviously, who deals with the project, but they all make use of freelance people. And the freelancers are starting from the translator, the revisers, the editors, the proofreaders. By the way, revisers, revising and reviser are terms not used in practice in South Africa. It's only translation and editing and proofreading. So revision is a book term. Okay? The only constant in all 3 projects was the translator. I wanted to keep the variables a little less. But all the other people are different freelancers. All the project managers were also different people. The only constant was the translator. Source text authors were involved in all translation projects. Why? Because in South Africa, people are quite bilingual. So if you were to translate between Afrikaans and English or English and Afrikaans, the source text author, if he or she is alive, is always present. And that makes the task of a translator quite difficult. Right. So let's see what's happening in real life. How did I do this research? Monday, who said that the archival documentation is underutilized in translation studies. What have I used for archival documents? I've come across or I've gained all email correspondence between the agents dealing with these 3 projects. So it's a lot of reading, a lot of analysis. The investigation was a comparative, the various revisionary activities that we've come across were both comparative and unilingual. And in practice, as I've already said, no distinction was made between revising and editing, and it's only referred to as editing. The agents we've categorized, the research, it was me and Dr. Amanda Lawrence, we've categorized the agents in the terms used by the publishing house, but the one reviser mentioned here isn't true. They haven't mentioned revising, it's a term that we've added, reviser. So the terms that the publishing house used was author, translator, editor, compiler, and proofreader. I will get back to the compiler later. And all activities of these agents dealing with the draft translation are referred to as, we've referred to it as revision. They've all used other terms like reading, editing, proofreading, whatever. We've referred to all of them as revision. So we've lumped all of those as revising or as revision. So the activities and the orientation of all these agents were analyzed. And the books that we've dealt with were the following. You can, if you want to, read the English translations. The first one is by Ingrid Winterbach, It was translated into English as To Hell with Cronje. It's a book on the Anglo-Boer War. Nowadays we need to call it the South African War to be politically correct. The first one is a highly canonized author, Ingrid Winterbach. She wins all the literary prizes. She's not too widely translated, mainly into Dutch and then into English, both for the American and the British market. The second book is Vaselinki, translated by Ilse Feinauer, as my name is Vaselinki. That's a youth novel that's also been translated or reworked or rewritten as a film. In South Africa, it's widely translated into Dutch, German, Swedish, Italian. The third book was, I don't give you the Afrikaans name since this is a compilation of various short stories, and this is where the compiler came into function, or as a person. It was, the English one was a compilation of 3 Afrikaans novels of short stories. This is an anthology into English. It's called In Bushveld and Desert, A Game Ranger's Life. This was mainly translated for American tourists. Okay, it's life and stories of a game ranger. He thought it would be nice, he mainly deals with Americans, so he thought it would be nice if they could read his stories in English as well. Right, let's get back to the assertions once again. The first one that we will be dealing with is this one, that there's a clear distinction between self-revision and other revision. Okay, this is the first thing that I am going, or that we were looking at. Now, we thought that maybe, or we felt instinctively that there's no binary division, clear-cut division between self-revision and other revision, but our initial hypothesis was that maybe there is some kind of linearity still involved. That the translator starts off as being the self-translator and then it moves gradually over to becoming other translation. We didn't think of a reversal of processes, but you see we actually did imply this with our arrows. So maybe we thought revision could be plotted on a continuum. But as I've said, in this you see the linearity involved. But little did we know, or before I get to the little did we know, in practice, we thought the revision process might entail the translator only engaging in self-revision. But the translator might both be simultaneously involved in a self and other revision process, with both parties suggesting changes and justifying choices. So, maybe there was something from a translator only engages in self-revision to translator and receiver both being suggesting changes and justifying choices, at least speaking to each other. No clear-cut division. So, our research questions were the following. Since we were seriously doubting this first assertion of Mossop, we formulated the following questions, and you could read them. Is the binary projection of self and other revision as to opposites reflected by actual processes? Is it not possible that a translator performs a self-revision, but that this also happens on the basis of feedback by others, for example, the author? Will the translator not be doing another translation when he or she works through the author's revised version although with an element of self-revision when he or she again reviews his or her own translation. Is it not possible that the reviser might do other revision based on the author's feedback on the translator's work, etc., etc.? So there are quite a few involvements going along. Now, what theory could we use? So what we actually found quite useful was Latour's actor networks, where he said actor networks differ from technical networks because unlike the latter, they are not necessarily stable. They may have no compulsory paths, no strategically positioned nodes. In other words, whereas technical networks appear as a given structure, as something that can be mapped, actor networks can only reveal themselves when activated. By highlighting creativity and unpredictability, both concepts, that of actor network and that of translation, point to the difficulty of reifying the process by which scientific facts and artifacts are produced, hence the need to analyze the process from the inside, to observe how actors make their decisions and interact while still unsure of the outcome. And this is exactly what we did, what our research entailed. So this analysis from the inside has given us the following results that we have extracted using the email correspondence from these various agents. So here we have, for the first, I'm going to give you the three books separately. I'm not going to read through everything, but you could see who was involved in each project. You have the translator's initial revision, self-revision by translator, but this, she relies strongly on the author to answer her questions. So here immediately you have a self-revision based on someone else's input. I'm not going to go through these functions now. Then the author revised. Now this is an other revision by the author, but she finds herself in a dialogue with the translator. And the translator has already applied the author's comments. So what now? Then you have the editor, or what we would now call the reviser. This is a plain other revision. Then this revision is given back to the translator. Now what now? Where are we now? Is this now still the translator doing a self-revision? Or is this now a self-revision by the translator, but it's simultaneously another revision of the author's suggestions applied by the reviser? And then you get another editor, what we might call a proofreader. This is once again a plain other revision. The second book, this was a complicated task because the author was extremely involved in this process. The author, the source text author, started to write extra text. When the original translation went back to the author, she started to write new text. So, once again, we start with the translator's initial notes with the editor's comments. That was our first set of documents that we've received. Here you have the author's other revision of the concept of the draft translator, but also much more. This includes the rewrites of the text. We have the editor, other revision after revision has already taken place, after the author has revised and the editor revises again. The author again, a type of self-revision that is based on comments. The author again, the translator again. So it's a to and fro the whole time. The third text and the last text, Here you have the translator initial self-revision, but she relies strongly on the dialogue with the author. Translator additional comments on aspects outside of the translation, for example, the content. The author, other revision, but only answering the translator's questions. Translator, after the compiler's edit, the person who put the anthology together also had a say on the translation as such. And then the translator didn't want that, so it wasn't an other revision by the translator, but it was on her own translation. But after the compiler edited, the translator after the editor, the proofreader, once again the author. So you see the complex workings going on. It's not a linear process. It's not a clear-cut self-revision, other revision. It's a total mess. So there we have our first and our main finding about self-revision versus other revision. So instead of our sharp-cut divisions, let's say this is translator, other revise or reviser, editor, proofreader, whatever, we got this. You could not unravel where does the one start and the other one finishes. So this was our first finding. Our second finding is that there was no clear-cut line between editing and revision. Okay, do we need the terms editing and revision? Can't we just lump them and say revising is the umbrella term? And that under revision, we might also put post-editing fuzzy matching. It's a question that I put to you. It's not, I don't have the answers. You must do the thinking on that. Is the looking again, isn't that encompassing enough for all of the tasks that you do after the initial translation? Sorry. Okay, so it does happen that a translator, back to the revision, it does happen that a translator performs an initial self-revision, but this process might involve a dialogue with another agent who might be the author, a dialogue with other agents to justify or to explain their choices. The translator engages in self-revision, yes, but simultaneously engages in other revision. The author engages in other revision, but sets up a dialogue with the translator. The author engages in self-revision based on comments from other agents. The translator, in other words, is indeed busy with other revision when working through the author's revised version of the translation of author's suggestions. Okay, editing, if you want to split, what does the editor do? The editor engages in other revision with the source text in mind, etc., etc. And if you want to split, you could have editor, a translator, you could have reviser, and then you have a proofreader. And the task that the proofreader did in all three was a light edit. Okay, to conclude the first assertion, what did we see? We see a very complex loop of revision processes. And it reminds us of Nord's looping model for translation. This one seems even a little more looping. Okay, it's even more complex, more wools rolled into each other. So, this is what we've come across. No clear-cut binary self-revision versus other revision. It's a complex process. So you see what would have happened if we've sent the students to the books only? To say, learn this. This is what we're going to teach you. Go out into the production houses, go and work into the publishing house. Tell your bosses this is what you're going to do. You're only going to do other revision. You are never going to deal with the text alone. You always have to refer to the source text. Okay, the translator needs to keep to the translator's work, only do the self-revision. Okay? So you need to do this type of research to teach your students what to expect in the real world.